All right, so recording is on. Yeah, so this is the SIG automation meeting on July 19th. So yeah, so what do we, is there any specific agenda items that we, let me have a look.
The one item we added last week was to start talking, somebody wanted to start talking about R2 planning. And I have some things that I put into, I think as like a skipped slide in one of the TSC presentations or something about like, here's the things we see immediately need to be done. But beyond that, and I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to copy it into there before the call and I can't do it now. But other than that, somebody else raised the topic. And so but I didn't see anybody else add anything into the agenda.
Right.
I
Sure.
was the one who suggested R2 planning use cases from last week. And my intention behind that was the SIG network architecture had seen presentation on policy and something else I forgot. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. So I was hoping we could have a position or an approach so that we can bring to SIG network architecture and discuss it instead of just, wait like last time.
I see. Okay. So on policy, so I think I haven't seen that specific presentation, although I chatted with the person who was going to do it. Like, I think policy is that they were using something that is built on top of OPA Gatekeeper, which is all great. Like, I think there's a few areas where you can integrate policy pretty easily. One is we already even have a gatekeeper kept function for validation, so you can integrate policy into the package pipeline to validate policy. The big issue with policy, as I see it for packages, I'm not talking about policy at runtime, which would be on the workload cluster, but with packages, is that because when you clone a package, you have full ownership of the downstream clone. And so a package author cannot put in a policy that you cannot override. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, I don't know. But I imagine that if I were Nokia or Ericsson or whoever I might want to say, here's my policy with my network function, and if you follow this policy, then you're falling within support, for example. And I would want a way to know that the policy that is in the derived package from my published package hasn't been altered. I mean, this isn't like, a security thing particularly. It could be, policy could be, but in the case I'm talking about, there's some trust with your customers, I hope, so it's not necessarily an issue, but it could be done inadvertently too. So one of the things I was thinking about was, like, is there a way for us to, validate that a policy hasn't been altered? So that's one. That's policy as distributed by package authors. There's another set of policy requirements I can see, or policy functionality that I would see that could be useful, is enforcement of package policies at the repo level. So you can say, it's all about the different owners of different roles. So somebody who, say, controls the cluster as the infrastructure person, and the person who, therefore, they manage the repository, they may want to be able to enforce policies and say, anybody deploying something on my cluster must follow these policies. And so the way I imagined implementing that was through policies that are enforced by some sort of administrative role on the deployment repository. So when you try and deploy something to that repository, some policy gets enforced that's outside the control of the package author or deployer. It's only within the control of the administrator of that repository. So those are the two things on my mind with respect to policy, in addition to the standard runtime policy, which is already part of Kubernetes webhooks and admission controls. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's my position. You asked what position we have. That's my position anyway.
No, that makes sense because last week or the week, I forgot when the last SIG network architecture meeting was, but I think Vim was there also, and people were talking about creation, packaging time. I know there's a better word for that. And quote unquote runtime, which is the second case that you're talking about. And the first case obviously is the packaging time policy, package policy versus runtime policy. So I think from my understanding, this dovetail with what network architecture is thinking. My intention was just to have a position so that when we go to, when network architecture comes to us and we go to them, we're not like, oh, we have to go back and think about it.
Right. I mean, no, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious to hear if other people had other thoughts or other areas policy could come into play. And by policy, I guess there's different kinds of policies, but the other question, Anne, so like, what do we, like, I'm trying to get a handle on, we've sort of let SIG1 drive the use cases. And, so from our SIG's point of view, like, if policy is the thing that if they think that's really important right now, we can definitely have that discussion. And like I said, I've anyway thought about it before, just a little bit. And the question is, should we as a SIG, and this is kind of a question for everybody, have our own opinion as to what needs to be done next? I know I have my opinions about what needs to be done kind of from a technical perspective, as opposed to from a use case functional perspective. But I'm hoping that SIG1 can give us the guidance on the use case perspective as to, it all comes back to me is what do our end users want to see? What will help them grow more confident in our approach? What do we need to prove to them? There's two, in an exploration like this, an early project, I think there's two things you're exploring. One is you're exploring the requirements and you're exploring the technical solutions to those requirements. There's probably more than that, but those are the two that I'm thinking of right now. And so technical solutions to the requirements I know about, I already have plenty of work to do. The other question I'm looking to SIG1 for is, what are the immediate requirements that we need new technical solutions to? And, how is that going to build confidence in this newer or different approach? Anybody have thoughts around those things?
If I may jump on the line, so
Yeah, go ahead.
I see two distinct things that potentially more belong, where the scope of a release belongs more in the SIG automation, whereas the other should be coming from SIG network architecture. So for me, use cases, let's say end customer use cases should definitely come from SIG network architecture. We should not interfere with that. How we implement it and the mechanics that are used underneath, right? So I think they will never, so they will probably not define that to us, right? So as such, I think if we talk about, or the way I look at it is that, for example, okay, we see that we need, for example, one of the things that when I was doing the write-up, let's say, identified is, okay, we took a shortcut, we took many shortcuts during R1, right? So for example, we built a Git repo, we standardized on Gitea, right? But we never made it generic enough to be able to support, let's say, multiple Git providers, right? That for me, most likely, SIG1 will not give us guidance upon. There's something that we will have to architect and support in some way or another to be able to do that, right? And that's for me where I see the distinction. We should not basically say, oh, we should do this or that or that. We should, so the use cases should come from them, but there is the mechanics or there is technical depth or implementation that we haven't done properly. Those type of things we should potentially have as an input towards the SIG, towards the release. And the release should constitute of a balance of those two things. Okay, that's my
I agree. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think there is probably certain ownership that, you know, the automation group can handle by itself, in the sense that which are primarily that cuts across use cases, right? I mean, a lot of the control plane components, functions are supposed to be generalized across all the use cases. And I don't see policy as such being spelled out in any of the working groups agenda in you know, SIG architecture itself. So I think there's one topic that probably, you know, we should own in this group. And but I think one thing I want to at least see is a concrete kind of a control plane, an architectural view, because right now it's a very implementation centric view, so that you can bring in these kind of generic functions like policy along with things like package manager, or the, you know, your the package orchestrator like the Porsche, or in this policy control, and how they kind of interact with each other, or some interfaces between them, so that you can finally, when you have use cases, you can actually nail down the end-to-end flow through the control plane system, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think my original suggestion is really to be prepared for use cases coming from SIG1, right? But in terms of technical feature that we could focus on or could propose, another thing is the whole intent thing from the top down, right? The topology controller and all that. I don't think we got it done. Or maybe we did and I didn't know. So that's something we could propose. Sorry?
Yes,
it's not done yet.
It's not done.
Think, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe something we could propose for as part of R2 to do that. But yeah, the use case is only to be prepared and respond to what I have heard in SIG1, not that we should propose any, or unless we have a really good reason.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Sebastian, you're next, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I given the presentation in the SIG1. So while preparing this content and while preparing this demo, actually I had three things in mind for building our platform. So one is the segregation of the role between package builder and the policy maker. So I think we should start building our platform, and maybe in SIG automation we should do it, and we try to segregate these two roles. And also, second point, we should take care about shift left and shift right ideology. So not all the policies could be done in the shift left. So we should try to bring the idea of validation at the time of shift left. So it will be helpful for the even network components also, and even the UP while we are hydrating. So when we are enriching our packages, so it will be helpful there. And the shift right approach, when finally we will deploy our NF. So that time, the runtime policy will take care of the NF. So that idea actually we can bring it. So the platform should take care of the shift left and shift right. And the third point, what I would like to add, the policy for the network components. For example, when we have prepared the KPT pipeline, so each pipeline produces some kind of output, right? So finally, those output could be validated at the last stage using the policy. So that is the one use case I can see. And also the second one, whatever the NF we deploy, for example, UPF, SMF, or AMF. So to validate those configuration, also we can create some policy so that could play a role at the time at the runtime. Also, we can think around the workload project. Finally, the whatever the packages we are going to deploy at that time, we can validate it. So these things actually we can bring some nice ideas in our platform, and at least we can start developing our platform independent of the use case. So whenever the use case comes, we should be able to handle it. So yeah, these were my thoughts around the policy.
Yeah, but didn't SIG 1 discussion include the idea of a separate parallel runtime capability to add policy or to edit policy, to work with policy as needed during runtime? I think that was raised, right?
Yes, actually, still we need to debate and discuss on the architecture, and also the use case we need to draw. So those things still left. So inputs are needed from the group.
Yeah, I think that's
So-
right. If I understand correctly. Sorry, John.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I would think so. I don't know if there are hands. I'm sorry. In the car.
No, at the moment,
It's
no
not-
hands, except
Okay.
for Subhash.
Oh, okay, so yeah, this is a really interesting discussion. So I'm wondering about, so if we step through the whole thing, right? There's policy within a package we already talked about. There's policy, say, at the repo level. There's policy at the Kubernetes admission control on the workload cluster. But one area I didn't mention, but I think you just said was, or maybe when you talk about shift right, like, one of the things we're talking about is building a set of best practices and also a set of tools, SDK, for building operators. And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to integrate some sort of policy validation, or even, I guess there's policy, right? It can be validating, or it can also regulate or modify behavior, I would think. I think we have to be careful with that. Like, I don't know, I'm curious about your sort of how you see policy. So for example, back a long time ago, when I used to work for a DNS company, we had a service that, you could establish and inject policy, and it would alter the behavior of your requests and your response. Or like the standardized way to do that is what they call like RPZs, response policy zones, right? So basically we did it a different way, but like, your policy is about the runtime execution, as opposed to policy at config time, which is what package and even admission control, those are like Kubernetes policies at the Kubernetes level. But there's protocol level policies, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Do we see a way to define those, or are those so different with every network function that, like, is there a hook point that into existing policy? How do other network functions do it today? I'm curious about this space, I guess, in general.
I don't think there's a standard. That's my view. So it depends on the policy is very. That was my comment also last week when there was a discussion. Is policy is very broad, right? So I think so far we have been discussing validation type of policies. If you really, so there is policies, for example, for traffic optimizations, right? There is policies for certain, like behavior definition, and then depending on the scope, there might be, let's say, standards, if you will. Maybe that's or there might be definitions on the behavior of those. And then you will see different kind of implementations of them, right? But that's the way you look at it. In certain scenarios, there is kind of rules, or there is systems being defined, and the exact implementation is then up to the vendor at some point. Sometimes they even define the protocol and stuff like that. So depending on what type of policy you're talking about. So it varies depending on what type of policies you look at least that's my 2 cents in this place.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is can we crisply define the scope of what policy means in NEFIO? And I would argue, I think, and I think this is what you're saying too, Wim, that protocol level policies are out of scope because they're going to be different from every vendor, and they're going to be, I mean, that's part of the secret sauce potentially of the vendor. Like that's just like, so it's an enormous world we can't even approach. That's how I'm seeing it from where I am sitting right now. That what we're talking about is policies around the configurations, I guess, if you think in terms of swim lane 1, yeah, 1, 2, and 3, certainly 1 and 2. I don't know about 3.
I talk about more configuration validation. I think that's what we mainly talked about, is what we are sending down according to a policy. Is it adhering to certain, let's say, rules that people have set up? Is the naming correct? Are there values being set that by no means should be set, right? So those type of things, I think that's what type of policy we are talking about, or as far as I can tell at the moment.
Okay. And John, I can bring one more scenario.
Sure.
Actually, it is happening in ONAP. So in ONAP, generally, we take the events from the NF over the best event collector. We just collect it, and we have seen that these events get analyzed, and some policy it gets get correlated with some policy, and policy gets triggered. And the policy then chooses the subject where to act upon. So it tries to complete that closed loop using the policy. So that is the one scenario is also there.
Yeah, sure. And I'm not, I've basically did not discuss many different policy scenarios. And that's one, for sure. But that's more typically in the security space and stuff like that, right? So is that correct? So is that where you basically check for logs and event from network function, and based on what you see, or also in traffic?
Well,
yeah, please go ahead.
So, sorry, I was gonna say, I think that, so if you go way back to the year ago diagrams, we have something closed loop or something we call it. I don't remember what we call it.
Closed loop,
but it's along those.
Yeah.
So the idea is that it's not just events, but it's metrics and analysis of those metrics, and then a feedback loop that says, hey, I mean, the example I use is the simple, because it's so simple, is, hey, we've been monitoring this function for 2 months, and it's never exceeded 8% of its CPU ever, right? So like, I think you're safe to cut it down by half, right? Like that kind of a thing, which could save people money. And those would eventually be policies, but they're almost, in my mind, a totally different kind of policy. It's just the same word, almost not the same thing. But I don't know, maybe somebody else has a different idea.
Yeah.
I think
I'm on the same page. Yeah, Tal is next, I think. I just wanted to finish this policy. I'm not sure, Tal, whether you have a comment on this policy. Probably yes.
Go ahead. That's okay.
No, you go ahead. I think.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking of all of this, I think, much more simply than than the rest of you. Obviously, there are many different kinds of policies, but I think from a technical perspective of what we would have to do, to me, it's pretty straightforward. Policies, like everything else, are expressed in KRM. So we might have a KRM type, a CRD that has everything, all the properties for the policy, or it could potentially, if we need something like Rego for OPA, it could refer to an artifact, right? So we do that with Helm too, right? You can refer to a Helm artifact somewhere with a URL, or you can refer to, say, Tosca, if we support it, refer to a Tosca CSAR via URL, but we wrap it in a CR. That's the kind of bottom line. Now, who handles that CR? In some cases, if we're doing something shift left, there could be a kept function that finds that CR for the policy and, say, registers the policy with some subsystem that runs in the management cluster. Or if we're doing something on the workload clusters, then it will just bubble down with config sync to the workload cluster and an operator would handle it. And it could actually be the vendor's operator for the network function. So part of our operator SDK might include tooling for specifically handling, say, OPA. If I'm just giving that as an example, it could be some other system. But from our perspective, we don't have to, I think too much about the different kinds of policies. We just have to find the mechanism for expressing policies, which we already have, that's KRM. And the various subsystems, I think they will grow organically over time in terms of what needs to be implemented. So some of them could be implemented in the management cluster with kept. Some of them could be implemented on the workload cluster with operators.
I don't think we have to define our.
Yeah,
sorry, I didn't mean to. I was just going to say, I totally agree with that. I think the thing is we do have to determine what our hook points are, right? We have a hook point in a kept function. We have a hook point in admission controls on the workload cluster. Those are already there. What other hook points do we need? And
well,
like you said, maybe it's part of the operator SDK. Yeah.
So I recognize two hook points that we already have. One of them is kept functions. So that's how we handle things on the management cluster. And the other is operators on the workload cluster, which we're hoping to have an SDK that will give you a rich kind of API to manage it. But people don't have to use the SDK, right? Potentially somebody can write an operator for OPA that does some specific things with OPA for network functions, and it'll just bubble down to the workload cluster and be deployed as part of the package like everything else. So those are our two hook points as I see it.
Now, Tal, a question on focus on expressing policies. Would we not use what is already out there, like using OPA and Kyverno? So for me, we don't have to do anything in my view because that's already done. We have consumers.
I think in many cases it's already done, but OPA is a very general purpose. We might look at some use cases that come in from SIG1 and say, okay, there's a specific kind of policy that we want to integrate. So it might just be also just a reference implementation that we give an example in Nefio on how to implement OPA for a specific use case. I don't know if it's free 5GC or whatever, use case we address. But at the end of the day, as everybody is expressing here, it's a very, very big field. We're never going to be able to do all the scope. I think what we're trying to do is find a way to and show examples of how we integrate various policy frameworks into Nefio. And we should probably show both things, a policy that works on the kind of management cluster side of things, like that's more general, and things that work in the workload cluster that bubble down to operators, et cetera. If we find a good use case that expresses it, because in many ways, the use cases that we're choosing for Nefio are example use cases, right? Because Nefio is supposed to be general purpose for any telco use case or for many telco use cases. I don't know if anything I'm saying here makes sense, but.
Yeah, sure. I think Subhash, you're next.
Yeah. So actually, just extending the same question. Are we looking to make it more generic, the policy framework? I mean to say, we should able to express our policy in very generic way. And let's say my system integrated with the OPA, or it works with the Kyverno. It should be able to work, and the end user should be able to communicate in a generic policy. So that fragmented policy, that is the problem of the operator. So we should also solve it. So so that point we can look at actually.
If I don't mind, or if you don't mind, I'll respond to that. I don't think we want to try and create a universal policy language. Like, I think what we want to do is more along the lines of provide integration points for different policy engines. And so like Tal said, we have two right now in kept functions or in the operator. I think that those aren't quite sufficient because of the ones in a kept package are completely in control, like I was talking about earlier, of the package deployer. And we might want something that's gives other people control and keeps them out of control, that they can't modify it. We also have today admission controls at the Kubernetes level, which is just in every Kubernetes cluster. Right? You can implement a policy there like gatekeeper. So I think that trying to, so in general, one of the principles is trying to steer away from pure abstraction, like techniques like, I mean, other than saying that we need to be able to reference it, we need to be able to do it in KRM, which might be a reference, right? Like Tao was saying, like that might not be directly embedded in KRM because only the things we need to be able to change or operate on with our automations or our user interfaces need the details in KRM. I mean, it's kind of a fuzzy line, honestly. Like I think over time you could expand the scope of what's in KRM to express the 80% use cases for different policy engines, but I think that that's much further down the line, in my opinion. Like this is where we get to that, like, yeah, where do we draw that line? And I'm afraid that that's such a big task to take on that it would be very distracting and overwhelming, and it's not like, I think we can solve it for now by reference effectively.
But John, as a long-term vision, do you think it would be useful, this feature? Because let's say some operator comes and he works only using the Kyber, and nephew is giving a reference implementation for the OPA. Then we're not able to accommodate a new framework. So still we are not solving the fragmented policy problem.
Correct. We're not solving the fragmented policy problem, and I'm not sure if. So if you look at, for example, cluster provisioning, we also don't solve the fragmented cluster provisioning problem. What we do instead is we say, we care about a couple of things about the cluster, and we're going to create this API for defining a workload cluster that allows us to modify those couple of things. And we're going to rely upon upstream, downstream, I don't know, projects like CAPI, like Crossplane, like KCC is the thing we have at Google. There's a few different things that are KRM-based cluster provisioning operators. And so we don't want to try to fully abstract across all of those, because frankly, it's been tried and failed many times, right? That's what CAPI is, and it has some success, but it's very limited in scope. Abstraction in general as a concept, which is very appealing, but when there's so many broad differences of independent groups building things, you need to have escape hatches. So I'm very wary of the idea of trying to create a universal abstraction. What I would rather do is create a framework where we can build smaller abstractions or APIs, as I call them, that are targeted for exactly what we want to do for our consumption by our automations, and then build the framework such that you can sort of connect those up to other implementations. So the way, like I said, with the cluster one is we have this workload cluster resource. Right now, all it lets you do is change the name and like the CNI plugins or something. And then we would rely on, we do it with a kept function, but it could be an operator, it could be done different ways to sort of realize or actuate that with any given downstream cluster provisioner. So if there's something we decide and we say, we really need to be able to change this policy, then we might implement a subset of functionality that says, here's how we control this policy, here's our API for controlling this policy. And then the Kyverno people or the OPA people or whoever can build a sort of translator in there. But we don't want to try and do that for everything because it's too big of a job. We just want to do it for the small little operations that we want to do and that are driven by our top level. That's kind of one of the core principles I'm trying to at least put forward for Nefio, because I believe down the other way leads a lot of challenges.
Yeah, I got it, John. So
I mean, yeah, I think the way I look at it, if I may respond, John, there is certain environments that are very mature, right? In which case an abstraction makes sense in my view. There are environments where it's a minefield of different options in which abstractions are difficult, right? As you were pointing out. So, and I think depending on the scenario or the landscape that we are acting upon, we have to determine what is the right approach, I think, right? But at least that's my
that makes sense. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Like, yeah, that's a big factor in how you make that decision.
Yeah.
Well, I would also suggest, we're thinking very big here. We can start small with a POC for a very specific use case, get a feel for how it works. And, if we need to build a more higher level abstraction, which I'm very doubtful we will be able to do and succeed with, then we can build on that. This is just such a big topic. I think starting small is a good idea.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
And also, John, I would like to add one more point. Policies has capability of validation, mutation, and generation. So we should also think around this kind of policies where we can demonstrate the power of mutation and generating a new object using the policy. So that space is open for us to think around the use case. Yeah, validation, right. Mutation, and generation.
Yeah,
that's an interesting idea. Yeah, I've been mostly thinking in terms of validation.
Yeah.
But obviously, yeah, all three are possible. We have to think about what that means.
Yeah. Because even today, right? I mean, look at it, what we did right now, just to dwell upon this, like naming, right? You could actually define naming through a policy. Yeah. Because right now we kind of, like naming is always a difficult thing, and because you need to make them unique. So Kubernetes has some specific elements to it because they need to be unique in a namespace and stuff like that. Some people prepend, put this in front and stuff like that. So we could have decided to use a policy framework to say, okay, this is what we are going to use for naming conventions, and then we just follow that, and then the implementations take it and adhere to it. At the moment, we have every controller, I think, that we have implemented has its own way of doing this.
I just want to point out that we already have a policy framework. It's called Kubernetes. Everything in Kubernetes is basically a policy, right? Deployment is a policy for how you create pods, etc. I'm sorry, I'm jumping in, but I want to just point out maybe one technical aspect that is worth thinking of is certain kinds of, there are two basic philosophies for policies. There's the declarative approach where you declare a general policy and you expect some sort of system to continuously apply it in some way, whatever it means for that subsystem. But there's another philosophy where you define a trigger, right? That you give the user the ability to actually say, when will this policy be applied if certain conditions are met? Now, that is something that we could potentially think of finding a framework in Nefio for not general purpose, but only for things that relate to Nefio. Let's say a policy, one trigger can be, we have all these events, right, in Nefio right now. One event is deploying. One event is when a deployment succeeds or fails, right? So we might need a way, I think, to express a policy that is triggered by one of these Nefio events, right? Things that are outside of Nefio scope are just outside of Nefio scope. Other kinds of events will have their own subsystems. But for Nefio, we could expose these events in some way that they can be triggered by other systems.
Mhm. Ravi, sorry to keep you waiting, but finally.
Yeah, no issue. No, I think Tal was basically my kind of lack of clarity is in that same thing. Exactly, how do you differentiate intents and policies? When you say policies, for me, I always thought it was some kind of constraint over that intent. For example, you're orchestrating an UPF and you say, okay, I need a UPF with this capacity, but the policy would say, okay, if you don't have this capacity, then I'm okay to go with the second option or something like that. Or policies around choosing a specific network, kind of networking secondary interfaces, policies that might be applied with certain QoS, certain constraints, and so on. So I think it'll be good to have at least some initial write-up on what we define as a policy versus like intents that might be coming from the kind of from the service orchestrator and so on. And I would still like to see that, say that, okay, we have policies that can be applied to the time of, say, package, where you kind of are applying at the kind of design time versus during the hydration process, during the actual deployment process, and have some use case on it. Otherwise, I think this will be kind of very vague kind of topic, and we won't be kind of hitting the nail to get the point across.
Yeah, I would suggest, which I think is said already by some people, is that that's where SIG1 for me should help, is to say, okay, let's try to solve these 2 or 3 use cases, and and then we can see how we do that, right? So, and then make it concrete for the beginning. I think Tal said it as well. Let's not boil the ocean, but let's be specific as a starting point. And then we can see and iterate over it, and then figure out a better or a more generic approach, depending on how we go about it, right?
Yeah, no, I just want to have that clarity on what we define as a policy versus a regular intent.
Yeah. I think today, I think we
differentiate.
Yeah, we already gave a number of examples, or various examples have been given, right? But from my point of view, it would be good to have a use case or a few use cases from SIG1 that we then see how we best implement this, right? At least,
yeah. From a few perspectives, yes.
Am I next, or are there?
Yeah, John, you're next. Yeah, you're next.
Oh, okay.
We don't hear you, John. If you're talking. I'm not sure.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I was just wanted to say the examples Ravi gave are exactly the kind of things that I was imagining as well, that they're constraints around the intent. So those constraints can be created by different people, right? The vendor who authors the package can insert some constraints. The people managing the infrastructure can insert different constraints. And so those are constraints on the deployer. So that's one aspect of it. And then there's, and those can be enforced at different enforcement points through the further left we do it, the sooner the deployer knows that they don't have to, they can alter their configuration to meet the constraints, but some things can't be done until later. So that's one thing. I'm totally in line with what Ravi was saying there. The other thing I wanted to mention was Tal talked about events. So I'm very wary of triggers in the sense of that aren't declarative. So with one of the key principles in Kubernetes and in declarative systems in general, but in Kubernetes in particular, is being level-based instead of trigger-based, which means that if you miss an event, if events pile up and the world changes, it doesn't matter, because every time you go to take action, you evaluate the state of the world and then try to create the intended, reconcile the intended state with the actual state. I'm a little bit, unless we define that, I'm a little bit hesitant about the idea of events. So I'd like to understand more what specifically you're thinking about there, Tal, and why we need things to happen based upon other things as opposed to things to happen and evaluate whether they're necessary. Like events are fine to tell us a reconciliation is needed, but the reconciliation itself should evaluate whether that event is still relevant. Because purely event-driven systems tend to have problems where events get delayed, and then the world's moved on by the time they get processed, and the system gets confused or events get backed up. I've seen that. So I'm curious if where your thinking is around that. What are the specific requirements that would dictate event-driven, or is your event-driven, as you describe it, still fit within this larger declarative model?
So at least in my
That's all.
thinking, it's all subsystems, right? So all the event handling, I definitely don't want us to implement an event bus or messaging system. So I'm thinking about this being entirely delegated to whatever framework or policy engine using and using their own opinions to handle that. But I did want to raise another issue, just because we're raising all the big topics and challenges we have. Validation, policy validation, again, I think should not be in scope for us. However, many policy frameworks involve policy reconciliation, by which I mean not applying it, but let's say you have 20 different policies for the same engine, but they actually have conflict between each other. So validation involves looking at all these policies together and making sure that they don't conflict with each other, or sometimes combining them together. I mean, you can have, say, a policy for bandwidth that says it has a maximum bandwidth, but then you have another policy that says you have a minimum bandwidth and they don't match, right? Here's a very simple example. So, you know, in my approach where I said it's all KRM, well, it's true, but maybe all the different policies in that KRM have to be kind of sent together to the subsystem, whatever that means. So it might mean that because kept functions right now work per package, right? So it could be that some policies would have to be defined at the higher level, right? At the, say, the topology controller. So the topology controller also uses packages, right? So those packages, some policies might have to be defined at that higher level so they can be taken together for the whole network service, right? Something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, Antu, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I raised the policy topic as a point of discussion, but you know, there are other things that we could also propose or focus on, like John said, technically for R2. And we so far have spent most of our time today on policy. So maybe for next meeting, we could start listing the technical topics that we like to work on for R2.
Yeah, I think that would be useful. I certainly Wim
I mean,
mentioned
I
a
don't
few.
want to derail R2, right? Just to talk about
Yeah,
policy.
no. I think,
No,
yeah,
I think for me, what makes sense, right, is we took some shortcuts in R1, right? I think it would be good to list them, right, and basically discuss whether it's worth considering some of these in R1, right? And then or at least that's what I would do, because otherwise we have everyone will put everything on the planet again, right? And we are trying to. So the problem between SIG 1 and 2 is who does what is going to be very blurry. So I would say let's focus on the technical depth or issues that we believe we have to address in R2, or technical depth, or let's say improvements on what we have done. Let's focus on that. Would be my suggestion, because otherwise you will end up with anything on the planet, in my view. And we are overlapping with what SIG 1 is trying to do.
Yeah. So that's what I was trying to articulate. The list of technical issue or topics that we need to work on.
Yeah, for me to name one, right? It's like Tal at some point says we need IPv6 first. What we did was IPv4 first. Do we want to figure out whether this thing works with IPv6? It's just an example I throw out. I'm not saying that we have to do that, but yeah. So these are the type of things that that are already in that we could do something about potentially. I don't know. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. I'm feeling a little bad because I raised the point of policy as an example, and then somehow we went deep dive on it.
We went deep into it. Why don't we do this? Well, partly that's because we didn't do you raised this last week and we didn't do the homework to put that list in here. So I think this is showing SIG, somebody showing SIG automation agenda. Oh yeah, that's us. So so yeah, if we can maybe do the homework to list. I have a list. It sounds like Wim has a list. I'm sure other people have lists. If we can just each throw in our list of really technical debt / known sort of mechanistic type of things, not use case, but just capabilities, then that'll give us a starting point. We had a fun discussion today, but I agree on it wasn't maybe the intent of your original topic, and I think the original topic's a valid one that we need to discuss.
I'm just raising, I'm putting it. Is this the right way to put it?
That works for
I
me.
think one consideration I always in mind is that, you know, we have these operators that is coming up with requirements documents, and basically they are seeing what they see in the production networks. And a lot of our implementation has been considering, you know, free 5GC and building, you know, automation around that. So there is that gap between free 5GC and what you see in production. How do we articulate that gap and how do we close it up?
Oh,
I don't know how do we kind of put that in.
How about some of our vendors make their network functions available? That might help.
That's true.
Actually,
yeah, at least
it's a really good point because on LinkedIn, you know, you guys know, some of you may know I post about R1, I mean about Nefio on LinkedIn, right? Like, hey, we're doing this. And one of them from Rakuten Symphony, which is the Japanese telco vendor, I think. He reached out and he's like, R1 is like, you guys are solving IT problems and ignoring that telco has already solved. And I privately messaged him back and say, hey, dude, look at it more carefully. And he complained that we didn't use CRD, we're using YAML. And I'm like, you know, you should go look at the code. And anyway, the long and short is he suggests that he should join network architecture or even automation to bring some of his perspective and then bridge the gap between what Ravi said, right? You know, what the telco and the vendors have raised and what we built, you know. So there may be an opportunity is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
So should I invite him to the next meeting here?
Sure.
His name is Attila Horvat, I think. He's
Or I
pretty
think it's even also good to have him in SIG 1 meeting, right?
Yeah.
because
No,
he's
I've already done that, but I thought that since Ravi raised the disconnect between the vendor and telco versus what we build, this is another opportunity to hear straight from, I don't know, a vendor, telcos / telco.
Sure. Yeah.
and they're one of the leading Open RAN implementers, so they're, I think, ahead in the game. So
Yeah,
for
he
sure, yeah.
specifically private message, he specifically mentioned 3GPP open API or AAI, forgot what, open something, as a model beside free 5GC.
Yeah,
Open OAI, you mean?
Yeah,
Open
open
Yeah,
OAI.
OAI,
Thank you.
OpenAI, yeah.
I hadn't
Okay,
had a
Sandeep.
chance.
Yeah,
Sorry.
sorry.
Yeah,
Sandeep just
Yeah.
raised his hand, and we are over time actually. So let's let's be
Yeah,
quick.
I'll just finish. Just made two quick point. One of the point is in the SIG architecture meeting we discussed about the WG4 work group, and the second is about the nephew R1 issues which are available in the to-do list. So just wanted to get the feedback, whatever from the Wim and John, that are we starting to work on the R1 to-do list, or what is the idea? What is the plan? Can someone pick up and solve some issues?
For what? Sorry, say again, Sandeep.
I mean,
sorry,
R1,
missed it.
I saw, yeah, I saw some to-do list in the R1 R1 release. Like there are some issues which needs to be solved yet. So what is the plan for that? Can someone look at to
So
them and
I-
start working on that?
I think R1, there have been a few little glitches and we have fixes for most of them. There's a couple of PRs still to merge. If there's things, if you were looking in GitHub and there's still things tagged as R1, they probably shouldn't be. I can go look at that. There were some things I think still on the topology stuff that we had, there was a stretch goal that may not have gotten cleared out. As far as actual issues that that cause people problems, I think they've all been fixed, but we haven't tagged a new release yet. So what we'll do is a 1.0.1 release, probably next week, that includes a bunch of little fixes that would make things run more smoothly. Beyond that, I'm not aware of any
Okay.
issues besides documentation.
The list which I saw has something like a clustered bootstrap controller and implement Edge Watcher gRPC server. Is it part of some list?
That's the
Edge Watcher
topology.
is moved
It's
out.
part of the
Yeah,
topology.
but yeah.
Yeah.
Cluster Bootstrap we have only for CAPI clusters, but we have. So Victor just raised in the chat, like, let's do something other than kind, and I agree. And we can probably pretty quickly do another CAPI type provider, but we don't have any of the networking. Well, Wim has a bunch of it. We just haven't.
I'm
we didn't
almost
bring it
there.
into
I'm almost
R1
there.
to keep the scope
I'm
out.
almost,
Scope
yeah,
down.
I'm almost there, John. So you'll be able to soon
Okay.
connect other clusters.
Okay.
But and I think that'll help with that inner network stuff. But we do still need probably like we had talked a long time ago about some workload cluster network operators and things like that we might start looking at in R2 as well.
Yeah, all right. Okay, maybe I can just discuss a few things in private Slack channel on this. Okay.
Yeah, put them on Slack and also bring them up next week, Sandeep, if you don't mind, right? That would be my suggestion.
Public Slack channel, like folks often DM me with things that could be in the public channel. I always prefer public because other people see it, then they don't have to ask the same question. So unless there's I prefer if people use the public channels when possible.
Okay, we'll do that. Second thing is about WG4. I put that if anybody interested to start working on the requirement for WG4, we already discussed in the architecture meeting that we can start working on that. So I put that in one Slack channel. So I would like to take this opportunity to invite more people to contribute to the WG4 requirements. Sanai and Kaushik suggested that we
which one is for?
It's for SIG1. It's a working group within SIG1, John.
I know, but what
focused
for
on
is what's
on Helm and
UI. And
UI.
experience. Yeah.
Helm and UI. And,
okay.
And CLD.
I mean, So the UI we have right now is not developed for Nephew, right? It was developed for general package orchestration with a few tweaks for Nephew. So we don't have to start with that UI, although we have a UI that does some things. It's got some principles and concepts in it. So it could be useful, but just putting that out there that it's okay to go clean slate if there's a certain UI, but anyway, just putting it out there.
Yeah. So it's just about the invitation to join that working group 4. We just like to take this opportunity to call more people. Yeah, that's all. So I'll put that in a Slack as
Yeah.
well.
Sure.
By the way, what are the working groups now? Like which is which? How many of them?
There are 4, I think, Antu, that I'm aware about. I don't know the exact. So one is for run. One is for use cases, I think. One is for architecture, if I'm not 100% sure about it. And then 4 is this Helm and UI and stuff like that. So these are the 4 as far as I know. There's a document. I'll try to find it up and then share
Thanks.
it. I might be wrong in what I'm saying.
No, because the Slack thread is all about meeting times, but not the actual working group description. So I'm not sure what happened.
It's and I've just shared the document.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ravi. Yeah, appreciate it. Okay, we are actually over time, so I would suggest we stop. And then
Yay.
we'll take it from here.
Right.
All right.
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
Yeah, thank
Cheers.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.